Let's say you had to convince a stranger to kill another stranger. And let's assume that the guy you're trying to convince has no criminal history, has no history of violence, there's nothing violent in his nature. He's just a normal guy. And let's say the target you're asking him to kill is somebody who he knows of but doesn't know well. It's not a family member or anything like that. And there's no personal stakes in this. You're trying to take someone from 0 to 100, where 0 is just normal person at peace, to actually doing murder. So you're trying to overcome all of the guardrails against doing that kind of thing, all of his upbringing, if he has any religious beliefs against doing murder, or just his innate sense of human life having value. You've got to overcome all of that somehow. Now, some of you immediately are going to say, well, I remember this from history class when we talked about how Hitler was able to brainwash Germany into doing the Holocaust, that you have this very specific process of dehumanizing the target or scapegoating them. You use language that refers to the target as some sort of an animal or vermin or as an infection. But I actually think that overlooks the key part of the case that you have to make, because after all, in our hypothetical, that probably would not drive our guy to murder. We may be able to use propaganda or rumors or whatever to make him hate this stranger. He may have bad feelings toward him. He may not want to work with him, but that's not enough. We need him to do murder. And when asking what would work, you have to ask yourself, well, what would work on me? What would get me to do that to somebody? And most of you are saying, well, nothing, but that's not true. See, there actually is one surefire, reliable method to get this guy to do murder, and it is the one that has been used by demagogues and cult leaders throughout history, which is you have to go to that guy and convince him that the person you want him to kill is a murderer and that he is coming after him. You have to convince him that it's self-defense. That is, in fact, the one way to overcome all of the objections that would come up in his conscience, because you can say, look, he's not just going to come after you, he's going to come after your whole family and then maybe your neighbors. In other words, you have completely flipped around the morality of the situation. Now, if you don't kill that guy, and then he does carry out his plans, you're guilty of murder because you could have stopped him. If the devil is real, this is his one trick, to convince you that doing murder is saving lives. And most genocides, most large-scale violence in history has had that element. The people carrying it out really did believe or had been told that it was self-defense, that this is a preemptive strike, that we are saving lives in the future. In other words, I think it is just scientifically and factually true that the most dangerous thing you can say about a person or about a group or about an ideology is that they are killers. It is literally, factually, the worst thing you can say about someone. It's the worst thing you can think about someone. But now we have a problem, because there's this very strange but extremely common belief that America is full of murderers. This is a belief that you will find in all parts of the political spectrum. The public in general believes that the crime of murder and the prevalence of murderers is exponentially higher than it actually is. It's the reason parents won't let their children walk to school anymore. It's a fear that they will be abducted and murdered, a crime that is incredibly rare, so rare that when it occurs, it makes national headlines. But the reason they believe that, the reason they are afraid to let their children out of their sight for even 5 minutes, is because this is the foundation of almost all of our popular culture, that our country is just filthy with murderers. In the post-apocalypse genre, in shows and video games like The Last of Us, the whole premise is that you've got a tiny core group of good people surviving, not just among the zombies, but among the real monsters, which is the surviving humans who have all become bandits. My least favorite Cormac McCarthy novel and film is The Road. where the entire premise is that this father and son are the lone two good people trying to keep the flame of humanity alive because every single person they encounter on the road is a bandit or a murderer or a rapist or a cannibal. They're all operating under the theory of the thin veneer of civilization, the idea that humans are savage, selfish animals, and that if you ever took away the police and the laws, that we would just go on a rampage. I mean, that's the explicit premise of the Purge series. The premise of those films is that crime is legal in that universe for one day out of the year so that people can just get it out of their system, I guess. And that on that day, the good people have to barricade themselves in their houses because the streets are just full of roving packs of murderers. And that film doesn't imply that most people are murderers, but it's a substantial percentage of the population. But even outside of that very specific genre, most of our films portray the act of murder as being far more common and far more accepted than it is in the real world. One of the funniest examples for me is the recent horror blockbuster Weapons, which is on streaming now. If you've not seen it, go watch that instead of this. But the premise of the film is that in the middle of the night, one night, 17 children all go missing simultaneously. They all run out of their homes spontaneously. And all of those kids are from a single classroom, and the teacher of that classroom was spared. She's fine, and only one of her students survived. And the other 17 have all gone missing, and the film picks up a month later. They never found those kids in that time. And in the movie, that woman, the school teacher, is being harassed by the town because it's like, yeah, there's a lot of anxiety about these children being missing, and they're starting to throw around blame. And it's like, okay, in real life, this would be international news. The entire country would have ground to a halt. Like, do you understand the media frenzy that occurs when one middle-class child goes missing under weird circumstances? And the even worse media frenzy that occurs when a school shooting happens, where you have this crush of media and politicians and conspiracy weirdos descending on a small town. Okay, so now imagine combining those things, having a small town where 17 kids have gone missing and nobody can find them. They have no suspects. They have no clues. That school teacher would not be getting harassed by the other people in the town. She would be famous in China. They would know her name in Moscow. Children in America would not be allowed to leave the house. Parents everywhere would be terrified of this happening in their town. And you can do that with almost any horror movie. Like Jason Voorhees has murdered 140 some people in that series. He would be world famous in that universe. There would be more movies about Jason Voorhees in the Friday the 13th universe than we have in our universe. An outbreak of violence like that, the President of the United States would do a speech about it. Do you see what I'm saying? In every case, we kind of make it seem like you could just lose a few dozen murders because they're so common, when in reality, they're not. And if you're saying, well, yeah, but that's just movies, of course the movies are going to make the world seem more dangerous and full of action than it actually is. Please keep in mind, I'm somebody who grew up in the 80s. That was during the Satanic Panic. For those of you too young to know what that is, it was the precursor to modern conspiracy theories like QAnon. The Satanic Panic posited that there was a network of Satanists who were sacrificing human fetuses by the dozen in their ceremonies. Like, they arrested and prosecuted people based on these accusations. And now think about what you have to believe about the world for you to think that's true. Because if even one infant was abducted and they found that its body had been ritualistically dissected, Fox News would be 24/7 on that story and nothing else. The idea that dozens of babies can be abducted and murdered secretly requires you to believe that that is a common crime, requires you to believe that in the real world that is a thing that just happens, and it doesn't. You will even see infographics going around on Facebook talking about how many thousands of children go missing every year. But that number represents literally every single time a child missed a bus and went to a friend's house instead, and the parents briefly didn't know where they were. In almost every single one of those cases, the child was found within hours and they were totally fine. In only a microscopic number of those cases was the child abducted by a stranger, and even in those cases, the child is recovered alive almost every time. A child being abducted and killed by a stranger is a crime that's so rare that when it happens, we know that child's name. People demonstrate by their behavior and by how they talk and by how they vote that they think murder is many, many, many times more common than it actually is. And if you try to tell people that it's not, they get extremely angry. They have an emotional attachment to this idea. This thing that is the worst thing you can say about somebody, the worst thing you can believe about somebody. The general public seems to believe that this is true of many, if not most, of their neighbors. I think this is very weird and very dangerous, and that it is worth discussing. Now, to be clear, this is not about people just having a low opinion of the public in general. I get that if you have worked retail in your life, you probably have a low opinion of the public. If you believe that the average person is not very thoughtful or is kind of selfish or callous or indifferent, if you believe that the average person is just not very brave or courageous or honest or hardworking, I'm not going to try to talk you out of any of that. If you say that the public in general is too indifferent to murder that is being committed by other people, that they can watch a genocide occur on the news and won't try hard enough to stop it, I'll agree. And in fact, I would say that most of the genocides occurring right now, the general public in the United States is totally unaware of them, if they've heard of the country that it's occurring in at all. But I want to zero in on this very specific idea, this idea of murder and murderers being way more common than they are, because I think it's actually very interesting and it's incredibly important. Because there seems to be two different fallacies at play here. The first is the belief in the prevalence of people who would kill for fun if they were allowed. You know, this is the premise of the Purge, is that when all of these people take to the streets to start killing, it's often not for any kind of a strategic reason. It's not gangs trying to take back territory or people trying to settle old scores. A lot of it is the idea that a lot of people would be serial killers if it was legal, if they didn't fear jail. So they will put on a weird mask and just go out in the streets and start killing for fun. It's also the premise of something like the Road Warrior franchise, where the moment civilization fell, people all just started putting on weird costumes and just ravaging the landscape, killing everybody they came across because it's like, yeah, now we finally have permission. But it is just demonstrably untrue that that personality type is common. I mean, every single day, there are billions of instances where somebody could kill and get away with it, and they just don't. Like, on top of all the opportunities to do direct violence, just think about all the people who work on assembly lines who could contaminate food if they wanted to, or sabotage a vehicle if they wanted to, in a way that would never be traced back to them. All of the times people are out hunting or hiking where they could just shove somebody off of a cliff. If they truly wanted to kill just for the fun of it, there are so many chances to do it, and they don't. When that type of crime does occur, or when a person does it a lot, when you look into that person's background, you can usually find a complicated stew of influences or illnesses or brain damage. But even among the population of other people who have that same background, the same illnesses, the same violent fantasies, the same abusive childhoods, even among them, murder is rare. Very few will take that final step to actually do it. Again, that personality type is common in fiction. In real life, it's just not. It statistically is not. This is not a matter of opinion. The world would look completely different. Your everyday life would look completely different if there was a substantial number of those people in the population. They do exist, but if you're a parent who will not let your child out of your sight for fear of your child running into one of those people, statistically, Your child is far, far, far more in danger if, for example, you let them go swimming. Swimming pools kill far more children than serial killers. Putting your child in a car and driving them to school, they are far, far more likely to die in a car accident on the way to school than they are to get abducted by a stranger walking to school. And if your response to that is to say, well, even if it is rare, what does it hurt to be careful, to have an abundance of caution? We'll get back to that. So that's the first fallacy that people seem to have, that the prevalence of psychopaths in society is just very common. The second one is the belief that murder is just a good way to solve problems for many people, whether they're career criminals or whatever. That if it was not for the presence of laws and police, that many, many people, instead of buying a home, would just go find a house and kill the family that lives there and take it for themselves. In other words, the assumption is that the way we fulfill our needs now by negotiation or trade or work, that those are all just artificially imposed by the system and by the laws. And if that stuff was all taken away, we would go back to doing it the much easier way. But again, in the real world, even in circumstances where people can get away with that if they want to, killing is often the worst way to try to accomplish your goal. Like, even if you don't have a moral quandary against it, the act itself is dangerous or strenuous, and then there's the risk of blowback afterward. Either directly because friends or family of the person you killed will come to get revenge, or more generally, if you normalize murder in your society, then you're just counting down until the day you get murdered. Like, if you normalize this is how you acquire things, then the moment you own things, you are a target. This is why Lord of the Flies was fiction. And if you've not read that book or watched that movie, it's about a bunch of school kids who wash up on a deserted island. And very quickly they form factions and they start murdering each other. In real life, there have been many instances of groups of people getting shipwrecked or stranded or their plane crashed in the mountains. And in almost every circumstance, they immediately started cooperating very efficiently. But of course they did. If it wasn't in our nature to cooperate, civilization would never have existed. We would never have gotten the thin veneer. We would never have gotten the laws and the police. We would still just be roving gangs of nomads. If civilization collapsed, you know what would happen? We would build it again because life is better for everyone in that circumstance. I'm belaboring this point for a reason. It's not just that it is statistically untrue that your neighbors are murderers. It's impossible. The world wouldn't look like this if it was true. And here's where we come back to the objection that I talked about earlier, which is, well, what's the harm in that? Shouldn't we want our cities to be safer than they are, no matter how safe they are? Because we all agree they're not perfectly safe. Even if it's true that most children are perfectly safe to walk from their apartment to the corner store, and that most women are perfectly safe to go jogging at night, isn't it wise to shine a spotlight on those few instances where something horrific does happen? Isn't that how you solve the problem, by really bringing it up into the public consciousness? But I would answer that with a question of my own, which is, do you truly believe there's no limit to how scared we should be of our fellow humans? Because we all recognize the danger of paranoia when it's in someone we disagree with. This cultural belief has objectively made our lives harder. For example, one reason why people don't want to have kids today is that it is objectively much, much harder to be a parent now than it was in previous generations, because the expectations we put on parents is higher. When kids today watch movies from the 1980s and it depicts that kids back then used to just leave the house on their own and stay gone all day, they'll come on the internet these days and ask, was it really like that? Like, did your parents really just let you get on your bicycle and stay gone the whole day with no ability to check in, no cell phone or anything? The answer is yes, absolutely. When I was like 10 years old, me and my friend used to go play in a junkyard. We would try to find glass we could break. Yes, kids used to walk themselves to school. They used to walk down to the grocery store alone. Yes, Parents used to be able to leave the kids at home alone without being accused of neglect. And the crime rate was much, much higher back then. All that changed, and the reason that now parents feel like they have to be helicopter parents, that they cannot turn their backs to their kids for 5 minutes in the park, is due to the new cultural belief that the world is full of murderers. It's not a harmless belief. It is not abstract. It is making your life harder right now. And so much of our politics, so many of the issues that we discuss today are predicated on this idea, on this irrational fear. Because of how I make my living, one of my big issues is free speech, an issue that I think both parties are very, very bad on. But their entire justification for suppressing speech is that the speech could activate one of the many, many murderers out there who are just waiting for a reason to do violence. That our savage instincts are just barely being kept in check to the point that playing the wrong video game or listening to the wrong song or listening to the wrong podcast or reading the wrong book could cause us to go out and take a life. And yes, if you accepted the premise that the public at large is one big ticking time bomb, then of course they can't be trusted with freedom of speech or any other freedoms. If it sounds like I'm working my way around to a conspiracy theory that the people in power have a reason to make us afraid of each other because it makes us easier to rule, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just the natural place that the incentives take you. My first job out of college was working in local news. Well, local news found out a long, long time ago, like with the invention of mass media, that what gets you ratings or what sells newspapers is crime. And for the exact same reason, politicians have found that you can get people to vote for you if you make them scared enough of crime and convince them that you're the one that can fix it. The media wants to keep you glued to a screen. The politicians want you to vote for them and give them all the power. All of them have found that the way to do that is to make you terrified of your neighbors. There's not much money to be made trying to say otherwise. And so over time, with the prevalence of media and with the prevalence of screens, you get more and more people who just don't leave the house. Or if they do, they make sure that they're not interacting with people who are different from them. You can watch them becoming more and more hardened toward their fellow humans over time. You can look at the social media comments whenever there's any kind of a natural disaster that hits a city. You saw it with the wildfires in California. You saw it with the hurricanes that hit the South. A bunch of people come in and saying, who cares? Those are the people that want to kill me. Their lives have no value. Why should I care about them? Why should I vote to send money to them? If I went down there myself, I would be murdered. I saw it on the news. It just slowly erodes your spirit. It makes you a worse person in a million little ways, in your own thoughts and in your actions. I personally believe that this trend, this thing that has been slowly growing during the mass media era, that this is actually bigger and broader than any specific thing that's happening in politics right now. And in fact, I would say that whatever you hate about politics as it's happening today is an offshoot of this, that this was the soil from which that grew. That if you can look out your window and imagine that half of those people are literal monsters, that they do not have the basic human conception of the value of life. The moment you start believing that, you're already most of the way to becoming the thing you're scared of. Which brings us all the way back around to the hypothetical I raised at the start of the video. When you say that an individual or a group or a race or an ideology is murderous, you are also saying that it is okay to kill them. It is, in fact, the one thing that you could say that would make it okay to kill them. It is not an accusation that should ever be done lightly. You should be suspicious of any politician or pundit or everyday person who does it, who either falsely accuses a person or group of being murderous or exaggerates how dangerous they are. It is taking you down a dark road that only ends one way if you follow it to its conclusion. You get this nightmarish paradox where the one thing that could make them want to kill you is if they truly believed you were coming for them. The widespread belief that your neighbors are murderous is the one thing that could make it true. Refusing to do that, refusing to believe the worst about people, takes courage because you are confronting that fear. You are taking the unpopular position, the one that won't make you any friends. You will be hated by your own tribe for refusing to hate the other tribe enough. And I think if as a culture there's not some collective movement to do that, then I don't know where this ends, but it's not anywhere good. If not eventually making the purge real, then a future where the only safe friend to have is an AI. Because real people and real partners are just too dangerous. Anyway, I wrote an entire book about this. Here's the trailer for it. One day, a woman you've never met before offers you $100,000 cash to drive her across the country. Half now, half when you arrive, 2,600 miles. But there's a catch. She has with her a large locked black box, big enough that you could crawl inside of it. She says you're not allowed to look inside the box, and in fact, you're not even allowed to ask any questions about the box. She says you have to leave behind any devices that can be tracked. No phone, no laptop, no credit cards, no GPS navigation. You'll be paying with cash and navigating with a paper map the whole way. And finally, she says you cannot tell anyone where you're going, and no, you cannot have time to think about it. We leave now. You hesitate. She doubles the offer. Would you do it? Maybe, if you're brave enough or desperate enough. And besides, you think, what's the worst that can happen?